There's a clay tablet in a basement vault at the University of Pennsylvania Museum that suggests animals were once smarter than humans. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The text carved into its surface describes a sequence of events that, if taken at face value, contradicts everything we assume about the order in which intelligence appeared on this planet. And tonight, as you settle in wherever you are, maybe comment where you're listening from, what time it is there, we're going to examine what these ancient Sumerian records actually say about who had wisdom first. The tablet is catalogue number CBS 1673. It measures 13 centimetres long, just over 10 wide, thick as your thumb. Baked clay, pale brown, inscribed with wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet earth 4,000 years ago. The cuneiform script flows across 6 columns, 3 on each side, perhaps 260 lines when complete. But 2/3 are lost now, broken away, the missing sections swallowed by time, or careless excavation, or simple accident. What remains is trouble. The tablet was excavated from Nippur, one of the most sacred cities in ancient Mesopotamia, during an expedition in 1896. It sat in the museum's collections for decades before scholars fully understood what they were reading. The text is written in Sumerian, humanity's first written language, and it tells a story that Mesopotamians called the Eridu Genesis, their account of creation, civilization, and a catastrophic flood. It's older than the biblical flood narrative, older than the Babylonian version in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is the source text, or as close as we can get to it. The tablet describes the creation of humans, the establishment of the first cities, the assignment of those cities to various gods. Standard mythology at first glance. But there's a detail in the text that doesn't fit neatly into our assumptions about ancient worldview. The narrative describes Enki, god of wisdom, keeper of underground waters, patron of magic, revealing to the flood hero Ziusudra information that will save him from destruction. Enki doesn't just warn Ziusudra about the coming deluge, he instructs him on which animals to bring aboard the vessel. The text specifies animals that came up from out of the earth, creatures whose presence is necessary for the restoration of the world after the waters recede. The phrasing is odd. Animals coming up from the earth. Animals whose survival is essential not just for food or labour, but for something else. Something the text doesn't explicitly name, but implies through its structure. The flood narrative isn't simply about punishment and survival. It's about the preservation of knowledge, the continuity of civilization, the passing of wisdom from a world that existed before the deluge to the world that would exist after. And in that transmission, animals play a role that humans do not. That role is what we're here to investigate, because CBS 1673 isn't the only tablet that presents this picture. Across dozens of cuneiform texts excavated from sites throughout ancient Iraq, a consistent pattern emerges. Intelligence in the Sumerian worldview did not originate with humanity. It came from somewhere else first. And the beings who carried that intelligence, before humans possessed the capacity to receive it, often appeared in forms we would call animal. Fish with human faces, serpents with divine knowledge, birds carrying cosmic secrets between heaven and earth. Not gods exactly, not humans certainly, but something in between, something that existed when the world was younger and the boundaries between categories had not yet hardened into the distinctions we now take for granted. What if the Sumerians weren't speaking metaphorically? What if their texts preserved memory, fragmentary, refracted through millennia, of a time when the intelligence that would later define humanity resided in forms that were not yet human? Not because animals as we understand them possessed consciousness equivalent to ours, but because whatever carried intelligence in the deep past took shapes that, to later observers recording ancestral memory, looked like animals. This is the question the tablets raise, not the answer they provide, but the question they refuse to let rest. Tonight we're going to read those texts carefully. We'll examine what they actually say, how scholars interpret them, and what alternative readings might be possible. We'll look at fishmen who taught the first cities, serpent gods who guarded wisdom, birds who carried knowledge between realms, flood narratives where animals serve as vessels for the survival of understanding itself. We'll trace a pattern that appears again and again: humans receiving, not originating, learning, not inventing, inheriting civilization from something that came before. The conventional interpretation is that these are myths, poetic expressions of natural forces, symbolic representations of psychological truths, religious allegories designed to teach moral lessons. That interpretation may be correct, but it's worth asking what gets lost when we immediately translate every ancient text into metaphor. Sometimes the interesting question isn't what a text means symbolically, but what it says literally, and why the people who wrote it chose to say it that way. So let's go back to that basement vault in Philadelphia. Let's stand in front of CBS 10673 and ask, what were the Sumerians trying to preserve? The geography of the first mind. To understand what the Sumerian tablets reveal about animal intelligence, we first need to understand who the Sumerians were, where they lived, and how we're able to read their thoughts 4 millennia after they died. Southern Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is where human civilization begins in the archaeological record. Not the first settlements. There were farming villages in the Levant and Anatolia centuries earlier, but the first cities in the sense we recognise them. Dense urban centres with monumental architecture, specialised labour, administrative hierarchies, and most crucially, writing. The Sumerians appear in this region around 3500 BCE, though their origins remain unclear. They spoke a language unrelated to any other known linguistic family, used a script they developed themselves, and built cities that would endure for thousands of years. Eridu, Uruk, Ur-Nippur, Lagash. These weren't villages. At their height, cities like Uruk housed tens of thousands of people within massive mud brick walls. Temples rose on step platforms called ziggurats, their heights visible for miles across flat marshlands. Canals crisscrossed the landscape, channeling river water into fields of barley and wheat. Workshops produced pottery, textiles, metalwork. Scribes sat in the shade of administrative buildings, pressing reed styluses into damp clay, recording transactions, composing hymns, copying myths. The writing they produced, cuneiform, is one of humanity's earliest scripts, possibly the very first. The word cuneiform comes from Latin, cuneus, meaning wedge. The script consists of wedge-shaped impressions made by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay at various angles. A tablet would be inscribed while the clay was still wet, then either sun-dried or baked in a kiln to preserve it. The baking process is why we still have these texts. Organic materials, papyrus, leather, wood, decay in Iraq's climate. But baked clay endures. Fire makes it stronger. So when libraries burned, the clay tablets inside were inadvertently preserved, hardened like pottery, waiting in the earth for archaeologists millennia later. For most of human history, no one could read cuneiform. The script fell out of use around the 1st century C, replaced by alphabetic writing systems. The wedges carved into ancient monuments became decorative curiosities, symbols whose meaning had been forgotten. Then in the 19th century, European scholars began excavating Mesopotamian ruins. They found tablets by the thousands, and slowly, through painstaking comparative work using bilingual inscriptions, they cracked the code. The key breakthrough came from the Behistun inscription in Iran, a massive trilingual text carved into a cliff face by the Persian king Darius the Great around 520 BC. The same text was written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Old Persian could be deciphered because it was an alphabetic script with known descendants. Once scholars understood the Old Persian section, they could work backward into the Babylonian, which was written in cuneiform. From there, they could begin decoding older cuneiform texts from Mesopotamia. By the late 1800s, scholars could read Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylon and Assyria. Sumerian was harder. It wasn't related to Akkadian linguistically, but Akkadian scribes had learnt Sumerian as a literary language, creating dictionaries and bilingual texts that allowed modern scholars to reconstruct Sumerian grammar and vocabulary. By the early 20th century, when CBS 10673 was being translated at the University of Pennsylvania, Sumerian was becoming readable again. What those translations revealed was unexpected. The Sumerians did not present themselves as the inventors of civilization. Their own texts described civilization as something given to them, taught to them, transmitted from somewhere else. The me, divine decrees, or powers governing all aspects of culture, were not human creations, but divine possessions, sometimes held by gods, sometimes stolen, sometimes transferred as gifts. Skills like agriculture, metalworking, writing, governance, temple service, all were described as received knowledge, not discovered knowledge. This is important because it establishes a baseline for how the Sumerians understood their own history. They saw themselves as inheritors, not innovators. Their cities were founded by divine decree. Their kings ruled because kingship itself was a gift from heaven. Their priests performed rituals whose origins predated human memory. Even their language was ancient. The Sumerian king list, a text cataloguing the rulers of their cities, begins with kings who reigned before the flood, men whose reigns lasted thousands of years, an impossibility that the text presents without explanation or apology. This is the context in which we encounter the animal figures. The Sumerians believed that before humans could build cities and write laws, before they could irrigate fields or administer temples, they needed teachers. And those teachers, according to the texts, came from the water in the form of creatures that were part fish, part human. The first of these teachers was named Duana, though later Greek writers called him Oannes. He rose from the Persian Gulf with the body of a fish, but also the feet, arms, head and voice of a man. He taught the coastal people everything necessary for civilization: how to construct buildings, how to found temples, how to make laws, how to divide land, how to plant crops. He explained writing, mathematics, astronomy. He told them how the gods had created the world. This wasn't a one-time event. The tradition describes 7 of these Apkallu, 7 sages who appeared at intervals, each associated with a different city, each teaching successive generations. They are described in both Sumerian and later Akkadian texts. They appear in ritual incantations. Their images were carved on protective plaques placed in Mesopotamian homes to ward off evil. They were not considered mythological in the sense of invented stories. They were remembered as real, as part of history, as the foundation on which everything else rested. Here's what mainstream scholarship says about this. The Apkallu are culture heroes, mythological figures, who personify the transition from barbarism to civilization. They represent the moment when humans acquired the skills that defined civilized life. Their fish form symbolizes their origin from the Abzu, the freshwater underground ocean from which all life emerges in Mesopotamian cosmology. The hybrid nature of their bodies represents the liminal space between chaos and order, between the pre-civilized and civilized state. They are teaching figures, projections of human desire for knowledge, poetic explanations for how complex societies developed. That interpretation accounts for much of the evidence, but it leaves something unexplained. Why do the texts consistently describe intelligence as arriving from outside humanity, carried by beings in animal form? If these were simply personifications of human achievement, why not present them as human? Why the fish bodies? Why the emphasis on their origin from water, from the Abzu, from a realm beneath and before the human world. And why does this pattern repeat across different types of texts, creation myths, king lists, ritual incantations, flood narratives, with such consistency? The Sumerian worldview was sophisticated. Their astronomical observations were precise, their mathematics advanced, their legal codes detailed. They weren't primitive people inventing random stories. They were systematizing knowledge, preserving traditions, recording what they believed to be true about their past. And what they recorded again and again was a sequence. First came the animal form beings with wisdom, then came the transmission of that wisdom to humans, then came human civilization. The texts treat this sequence as history. The question is whether we should do the same. Not history in the sense of journalistic accuracy. We're not claiming fishmen literally walked out of the sea in 4000 BCE, but history in the sense of preserved memory, however distorted by time. Memory that something preceded human civilization. Memory of a transfer of knowledge from a source that, to those recording the memory, seemed non-human or pre-human. Memory encoded in the imagery available to Bronze Age scribes, fish, serpents, birds. This reading doesn't require us to believe the literal details. It requires us to take seriously the structure of the narrative. Intelligence didn't originate with humans. It was transmitted to humans. The transmitters were remembered in forms we would call animal. That's the framework within which we'll examine the specific texts. We're not looking for proof of anything. We're looking for patterns, for consistencies, for what the Sumerians themselves said about the order in which wisdom appeared in their world. And we're asking, what did they know that we've forgotten before the cities rose? There's a clay object in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, catalogue number WB444, that lists kings who ruled before the flood. The text is precise, formal, administrative in tone. It reads like a bureaucratic record, the kind of document you'd file in a government archive. Except the reigns it records last thousands of years, and the kings it names ruled cities that were buried beneath floodwaters before human history as we understand it began. The object is called the Weld Blundell Prism. It's a four-sided clay prism, about 8 inches tall, inscribed on all sides with columns of cuneiform text. Each face lists kings in chronological sequence, beginning with rulers from before the deluge and continuing through historical dynasties whose reigns we can verify through other sources. The prism was excavated at Larsa in southern Iraq in 1922. Its text is one version of the Sumerian king list, a composition that existed in multiple copies, all following the same basic structure. Kingship descended from heaven, was established in various cities, passed through a series of rulers, was interrupted by a great flood, then resumed anew. Cities after the waters receded. The antediluvian section is what concerns us here. According to the king list, before the flood, kingship was held in 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak. 8 kings ruled across these cities. Their reigns totaled 241,200 years. The text presents this information matter-of-factly with the same formulaic phrasing used for later historically attested rulers. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. In Bad Tabira, Emegalana ruled for 43,200 years. The numbers are impossible, but the tone is not fantastical. This is not epic poetry. This is administrative record-keeping applied to a period that precedes normal chronology. Mainstream scholarship treats these antediluvian kings as mythological, and for good reason. No human lives 28,000 years. No city-state endures for 40,000. The numbers are symbolic, possibly representing astronomical cycles, possibly inflated through textual corruption, possibly invented to create an aura of immense antiquity. The antediluvian section functions as a mythological prologue, establishing that kingship itself is ancient beyond memory, that the institution predates anything resembling normal history. But here's what makes the list interesting for our purposes. The antediluvian kings aren't described as fundamentally different from later kings in terms of their role or function. They rule, they build, they maintain temples, they govern cities, The text treats them as continuous with the human kings who came after the flood, just separated by an event that interrupted the sequence. And some sources suggest that these early rulers weren't entirely human, or at least that the nature of rulership in the antediluvian period was different in ways the later text doesn't fully preserve. One intriguing detail appears in scholarly analysis of the king list. Some antediluvian kings are associated with the Apkallu, the fish-formed sages who taught civilization. The first king, Alulim, rules in Eridu at the same time Yuana, the first Apkallu, arrives from the sea to teach humanity. The association isn't explicit in the king list itself, but it's preserved in later Mesopotamian tradition, where each antediluvian king is paired with one of the 7 sages. The pairing suggests that kingship in the earliest period required guidance from non-human teachers, that human rulers couldn't function without instruction from these fish-bodied figures. This creates an interesting picture of the antediluvian world. Humans are present. The king list describes human rulers with human names. But those rulers depend on wisdom from outside humanity. The cities they govern were founded not by human decision, but by divine decree. The skills they employ were taught by beings from the sea. Kingship itself descended from heaven. It wasn't developed through trial and error or social evolution. The entire structure of early civilization is presented as received, not invented. Then the flood comes. CBS 100673, the Eridu Genesis tablet we started with, describes this event. The gods decide to destroy humanity. The text doesn't fully explain why. This section is fragmentary, but later Mesopotamian flood narratives cite noise, overpopulation, human wickedness. The god Enlil decrees annihilation. The other gods consent. But Enki, the god of wisdom and water, warns the flood hero Ziusudra. He tells him to build a boat, to load it with animals, to preserve what must not be lost. The description of the flood is stark. All the evil winds, all stormy winds gathered into one, and with them the flood was sweeping over the cities. For 7 days and 7 nights the deluge lasts. Then the sun returns. Ziusudra opens a hatch in the boat and makes sacrifice to the gods. The gods, smelling the offering, relent. They grant Ziusudra eternal life and settle him in Dilmun, a paradisiacal land beyond the mountains. The structure parallels the later biblical account, but there are differences. In the Sumerian version, Ziusudra is explicitly described as a king and a priest, a man who already possesses knowledge of divine service before the flood. He doesn't need to invent civilization after the waters recede, he preserves it. The animals aboard the boat aren't just breeding stock for future agriculture, they're described as necessary for the restoration of the world, essential components of what must survive. Why animals specifically? One reading is practical, you need animals to rebuild an agricultural society. But the text's emphasis suggests something more. The phrase animals that came up from out of the earth appears in the creation section of CBS 10673, describing how the gods made the small animals that came up from out of the earth come from the earth in abundance immediately after creating humans. The animals aren't secondary to the human world, they're parallel to it, created alongside it, part of the foundational order. Their survival in the flood narrative ensures not just ecological continuity, but cosmic continuity. The structure of the world itself depends on their presence. This becomes clearer when we look at the post-flood section of the king list. After the deluge, the text says the kingship descended from heaven again, not was restored, but descended, as if it had to be reintroduced from outside the human realm. The first city to receive kingship after the flood is Kish. Its first king, according to some versions of the list, ruled with the guidance of sages. The Apkallu tradition continues in modified form. The need for external wisdom doesn't end with the flood. What the Sumerian text suggests then is not a linear progression from primitive to civilized, but a cyclical pattern, wisdom exists, is transmitted to humans, is lost, is transmitted again. Humans don't generate civilization from within themselves. They receive it, maintain it, lose it, receive it again. And the beings who carry that wisdom across the boundary, who preserve it during the catastrophe, are described in forms that aren't human. The antediluvian period becomes, in this reading, a memory of time before humans were the primary intelligence on Earth. Not because humans didn't exist, the king list acknowledges human rulers, but because humans weren't yet the keepers of knowledge. They ruled, but they ruled under instruction. They built, but they built according to patterns taught from outside. They governed, but they governed through wisdom received from fishmen who rose from the sea. This could be pure mythology. The Sumerians could have invented the entire framework to explain their own origins, creating a noble lineage that stretched back into an impossibly distant past. But if that's the case, we still have to explain why they chose this particular framework. Why not simply claim divine descent for their cities? Why not say the gods taught humans directly? Why insert these intermediate figures, these animal form sages, into the narrative at all? The simpler reading is that the Sumerians were preserving something, not exact history, but structural memory. Memory that what they called civilization arrived from outside. Memory that its transmission required figures who weren't gods and weren't quite human either. Memory that, before the world they knew existed, the order of intelligence was different. And that memory is preserved in the reign lengths of impossible kings, in the pairing of rulers with fishmen, in the emphasis on animals surviving the flood. The antediluvian world, as the Sumerians described it, was not our world yet. It was something earlier, something where the boundaries between categories hadn't settled into the forms we now accept as natural. The flood marks the transition. After it, humans become fully human, cities become permanent, history becomes recognizable. But before it, in that deep past the king list memorializes with its absurd chronology, something else held the knowledge we would later inherit. The seven who came from water. The tablets call them apkallu. The word means sage, or wise man, or expert. But these weren't human sages. The texts are explicit. They came from the Abzu, the fresh water ocean beneath the earth, and they had the bodies of fish. The clearest description comes from Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC, who summarized older Mesopotamian traditions for his Hellenistic audience. He describes Oannes, the Babylonian pronunciation of the Sumerian Yuana, as a creature with the body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head, another head, human. Human feet emerged from the fish's tail. The creature could speak with a human voice. It rose from the Erythraean Sea, the Persian Gulf, in the daytime, and taught the coastal inhabitants everything necessary for civilized life, then returned to the water each night. Berossus wasn't inventing this. He was translating traditions preserved in cuneiform tablets that are now lost, but whose content can be reconstructed from surviving ritual texts, incantations, and protective inscriptions. These sources consistently identify 7 apkallu, each associated with one of the antediluvian kings, each a teacher of specific knowledge. The first, Yuana, taught writing, mathematics, temple construction, and the arts of civilization. The second, Uanaduga, taught magic and healing. The third, Enmaduga, taught architecture and astronomy. The pattern continues through all 7. Archaeological evidence confirms the apkallu were taken seriously as protective figures. Neo-Assyrian palaces and temples featured stone reliefs depicting them. The most common representation shows a human figure with the head and lower body of a fish, carrying a bucket and a cone-like object, often interpreted as tools for ritual purification. These plaques were installed at doorways and entrances, warding off evil spirits. They weren't decorative, They were functional, charged with spiritual authority derived from the Apkallu's identity as ancient teachers and guardians. Cuneiform texts cite the Apkallu in ritual formulas. One incantation from the first millennium BC reads, "The Apkallu, the pure Puradu fish, the great Paratu fish from the Abzu, purify and cleanse the house." The language is formulaic, protective. The Apkallu aren't distant mythological figures. They are actively invoked as presences capable of intervening in the human world, driving out malevolent forces, maintaining cosmic order. What's striking is how the texts describe their function. The Apkallu don't just teach practical skills like agriculture or carpentry. They transmit the me, the divine decrees that govern existence. They reveal the heart of heaven and earth, a phrase that appears in multiple sources and seems to mean something like the fundamental structure of reality, the principles underlying creation. This isn't basic instruction, it's cosmic knowledge, the kind of understanding that allows humans to participate in divine order rather than simply exist within it. The timing matters. The Apkallu appear before the flood, during the antediluvian period when cities were first being founded. After the flood, the tradition says their role changes. They no longer walk openly among humans. Instead, they transmit knowledge through dreams, omens, and indirect revelation. The flood marks a boundary. Before it, non-human wisdom keepers interacted directly with humanity. After it, that interaction becomes mediated, symbolic, hidden. Why fish bodies? The standard scholarly explanation is symbolic. Fish come from water. Water represents the Abzu. The Abzu is the source of all wisdom in Mesopotamian cosmology. Therefore, fishmen represent wisdom emerging from its primordial source. This explanation is probably correct on a symbolic level, but it doesn't fully account for the specificity of the imagery. Why not water itself as a symbol? Why not waves, rivers, floods? Why embodied creatures with fish flesh and human speech? One possibility is that the image preserves memory of something real, filtered through the conceptual vocabulary available to Bronze Age scribes. Not literal fishmen, but something that appeared to emerge from water, something associated with the coast or the marshlands, something that taught skills and then departed, and the only way to encode that memory was through hybrid imagery that captured the strangeness of the encounter. Consider the context. The cities where the Apkallu tradition originates, Eridu, Ur, Uruk, are located in southern Mesopotamia near the coast of the Persian Gulf in antiquity. This is marshland, wetland, a liminal environment where earth and water blur. It's also where contact with seafaring peoples would have occurred. If advanced knowledge arrived via maritime trade routes, if strangers came from the sea bringing writing or metalworking or astronomical calculation, the local population might remember them as sea creatures, beings associated with water, teachers who came and went with the tides. This isn't to reduce the myth to a prosaic explanation. It's to ask whether the myth might encode actual cultural memory, however transformed by centuries of retelling. The Sumerians themselves didn't think they'd invented writing independently. They described it as taught, received, a gift from the sea. The question is whether that's pure narrative invention or whether it reflects some historical process now irrecoverable except through the imagery the myth preserves. Another dimension appears when we examine where the Apkallu fit in the divine hierarchy. They aren't gods. The texts are clear on this. They serve the gods, specifically Enki, the god of wisdom and water. But they aren't human either. They occupy a third category, beings of knowledge who exist between the divine realm and the human world, mediating the transmission of understanding from one to the other. This intermediary status is crucial. If the Sumerians wanted to attribute civilization to the gods directly, they could have, but they didn't. They inserted these hybrid figures into the causal chain. The gods create, the Apkallu teach, humans learn. The sequence requires all three categories. Remove the Apkallu and the story doesn't work. Humans can't receive divine knowledge directly. They need intermediaries who can move between realms. The form those intermediaries take, fish bodies, animal features, suggests that the Sumerians understood intelligence itself as not confined to human shape. The Apkallu can think, speak, teach, remember, plan. They possess all the cognitive capacities we associate with personhood, but they don't look like persons in the human sense. Their minds are housed in bodies we would classify as animal. This challenges the assumption that intelligence and human form necessarily go together. Neo-Assyrian ritual texts push this further. They describe not just fish form Apkallu, but bird form ones as well. Figures with the heads and wings of eagles, but the bodies of humans, or sometimes fully avian forms depicted with scrolls and writing implements. The variety of animal forms suggests that what mattered wasn't the specific species but the category, non-human, but wise, capable of knowledge, but not contained within human boundaries. This brings us to a pattern that will repeat throughout these texts. Wisdom in Mesopotamian thought doesn't originate with humanity. It exists prior to humans, outside humans, in forms that precede or transcend human embodiment. Humans access wisdom, they don't create it. And the beings who carry that wisdom across the threshold, who make it available to human consciousness, appear in shapes we would call animal. The Apkallu tradition suggests that, in the beginning, before cities and writing and kingship, knowledge resided elsewhere. It was brought to humans by creatures from the sea. And those creatures, whatever they were in historical reality, were remembered in the text as having fish bodies, fish voices, fish lives, yet human minds. The Sumerians honoured them, carved their images, invoked their protection, remembered their names, and in doing so preserved the idea that intelligence on Earth didn't start with us. It came from somewhere else first. We learnt it. We received it. We were taught by beings who rose from water and then returned to water, leaving behind the gift of civilization. That's what the tablets say. The question is what to do with what they say. Intelligence in scales and feathers. Beneath the Sumerian city of Eridu, archaeologists found something unexpected. The oldest religious structure in Mesopotamia, a temple built and rebuilt on the same spot for 2,000 years, each iteration constructing its foundations atop the ruins of the previous structure until the sanctuary rose on a platform made from its own history. This was the temple of Enki, god of wisdom, magic, and the freshwater Abzu. And guarding this temple, carved into cylinder seals and protective amulets, is a figure with a double serpent emerging from his shoulders. Ninjasida, the lord of the good tree, a god whose form is reptilian, but whose role is the transmission of knowledge. Ninjasida isn't an Apkallu, he's a god in his own right, associated with vegetation, the underworld, and the boundary between life and death. But his serpent form connects him to an older pattern, a pattern where beings who hold wisdom appear in animal shape. Snakes in Mesopotamian thought aren't evil as they become in later biblical tradition. They're sacred, liminal, associated with Earth's fertility and the underworld's mysteries. They shed their skin and seem to renew themselves, which makes them symbols of transformation and hidden knowledge. And Ningizida, whose very name contains the word for good tree, is one of several Mesopotamian deities whose wisdom is inseparable from their animal nature. The texts describe Ningizida as the great dragon who stands in Eridu. He guards the threshold between the earthly realm and the deep waters of the Abzu. His dual-headed serpent form represents not monstrosity but completeness, the union of opposites, the capacity to see in multiple directions simultaneously, the access to knowledge from realms humans can't reach. He's invoked in healing incantations, where his serpent power drives out sickness. He appears in visions, where the underworld is revealed. He's linked to Dumuzi, the dying god whose descent and return mark the agricultural cycle. But the more interesting figure for our purposes is the bird. The Lugalbanda epic, preserved on old Babylonian tablets from around 1800 BC, tells the story of a king of Uruk who falls ill during a military expedition. His companions abandon him in a cave high in the mountains, assuming he'll die. But Lugalbanda survives, makes offerings to the gods, and encounters the Anzu bird, a massive eagle-like creature with the body of a storm cloud, whose wings generate thunder and whose cry shakes the mountains. The Anzu is both terrifying and divine, a being of raw power who lives in the wild places beyond human civilization. Lugalbanda doesn't fight the Anzu, he honours it, he makes offerings, and in return the Anzu grants him extraordinary abilities, speed beyond human limits, strength beyond mortal capacity, perception that penetrates hidden things. The bird's gift isn't just physical enhancement, it's knowledge. Lugalbanda becomes capable of navigating the wilderness, understanding animal speech, moving between the human world and the wild with ease. The Anzu's blessing transforms him from an ordinary man into someone who can mediate between civilization and nature, between the city of Uruk and the mountains where the gods dwell. The Anzu bird appears in other texts as well. In the myth of Anzu, the creature steals the Tablet of Destinies, a divine object that grants whoever possesses it control over the me, the decrees governing reality. The theft represents cosmic chaos, knowledge and power in the wrong hands, or perhaps in non-human hands, unsupervised by the gods who believe they should monopolize such authority. The god Ninurta eventually defeats the Anzu and recovers the tablet, restoring order. But the fact that the bird could steal divine knowledge in the first place suggests it possessed intelligence and agency of its own. This wasn't a mindless beast. It understood what the tablet was, knew its value, chose to take it. What connects Ningazida, the Anzu, and other animal form wisdom figures is their location at boundaries. Ningazida stands between the earth and the Abzu, between life and death. The Anzu dwells between civilization and wilderness, between the mountains and the sky. The Apkolu emerge from the boundary between water and land. These aren't creatures who live within human space. They exist at edges, in liminal zones where categories blur, and it's at those edges that knowledge appears. Mesopotamian cosmology treats boundaries as generative. The world begins when Apsu and Tiamat's mingle. The boundary between fresh and salt creates life. Cities are built where desert meets marshland, where water can be controlled but wilderness remains close. Temples stand at thresholds marked by gates where divine and human realms intersect, and beings who carry wisdom, who possess understanding that exceeds ordinary human capacity, are associated with these threshold spaces, embodied in forms that themselves transgress boundaries, fish with human speech, serpents with divine authority, birds with cosmic knowledge. The question this raises is whether the animal form is incidental or essential. Are these figures depicted as animals simply because ancient peoples used animals as symbols, the way modern culture uses abstract concepts, or does the animal form indicate something about the nature of the knowledge itself, that it originates outside human consciousness, that accessing it requires engagement with non-human intelligence, that wisdom at this level doesn't fit comfortably into human minds? There's a text from the old Babylonian period, part of a larger composition about the education of scribes, that describes a teacher saying to his student, "The heart of the scribe is like a spring that does not run dry." The image is water, again, knowledge flowing up from underground, inexhaustible, not created by the scribe, but channeled through him. The scribe's role is to tap into that source, to bring it to the surface, to make it available. He doesn't generate the knowledge himself, he connects to it. This is the function the animal wisdom keepers perform in the myths. They're connectors, intermediaries between the source of knowledge and the human mind that will eventually house it. Their animal bodies mark them as other than human, but their capacity to teach marks them as possessed of mind. They aren't mere symbols. Within the logic of the myths, they think, choose, act with intention. They have something humans need, and they can communicate it. Cylinder seals from Sumerian sites frequently depict scenes of humans approaching animal form deities, making offerings, receiving blessings. The iconography is formalized, standardized poses, repeated compositions, which suggests these weren't isolated incidents, but ongoing relationships. The human world depended on maintaining proper relations with the animal wisdom figures. Neglect that relationship and civilization suffered. One seal, now in the Louvre, shows a worshipper approaching a figure seated on a throne, flanked by serpents. The seated figure is human-shaped, but the serpents suggest the presence of Ningazida. Behind the worshipper is a bullman, another hybrid creature, human above, bovine below, who guards sacred spaces. The scene depicts layers of mediation. The human can approach the divine, but only through the presence of animal form guardians and guides. Access to knowledge requires navigating this hierarchy of beings, each occupying a different zone in the cosmic structure. What emerges from these images and texts is a worldview where intelligence is distributed across categories. Humans possess intelligence, yes, but so do gods, and so do the intermediate beings who wear animal shapes. The capacity to know, to remember, to understand, to teach, these aren't uniquely human attributes. They exist in multiple forms, embodied in multiple ways. This isn't animism exactly, where every rock and tree has a spirit. This is more specific. Certain beings, associated with certain animals, hold certain kinds of knowledge. The fishmen know writing and mathematics and city planning. The serpent god knows healing and underworld mysteries. The great bird knows navigation and wilderness survival and the hidden names of mountains. Each form of intelligence corresponds to a form of embodiment, and all of it precedes human civilization. The Sumerian texts don't explain why this should be so. They don't theorize about intelligence or consciousness. They simply describe it. Knowledge came from water, carried by fish. Knowledge guards temples, embodied in serpents. Knowledge dwells in mountains, riding the wings of birds. Humans learned from these sources, and in learning, they became what they are. But the original intelligence, the first knowledge, belonged to forms we would call animal. That's the claim embedded in the myths. Not stated directly, but implied by the structure of every narrative. Humans don't invent, humans receive. And what they receive arrives in scales and feathers before it arrives in words. The Abzu and the question of first knowledge. 4 miles south of Nasiriyah in modern Iraq, beneath windswept mounds barely noticeable in the flat desert landscape, lies the ruin of Eridu. This was the first city according to Sumerian tradition, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, the city of Enki, god of wisdom. And beneath Eridu's oldest temple, according to the cosmology encoded in its design, lay the Abzu, the vast underground ocean of sweet water from which all life and knowledge springs. The Abzu isn't a metaphor in Mesopotamian thought, it's a real place, or it was understood as one. The word refers to the subterranean freshwater aquifer, the source of springs and wells, the hidden reservoir that made agriculture possible in a desert landscape. But it also means something more. The Abzu is the dwelling place of Enki. It's the origin point of creation, where the first gods came into being. And most crucially for our investigation, it's described as the storehouse of all knowledge, the place where the me, those divine decrees governing every aspect of existence, are kept. This creates an interesting problem. If knowledge exists in the Abzu before humans exist, then knowledge precedes human consciousness. It's not something humans discover through experience or reason. It exists independently, waiting to be accessed, transmitted, brought to the surface. The Abzu becomes, in this reading, something like a cosmic database, a repository of information that has always existed, that no one created, that simply is. The Barton cylinder, catalogue number CBS 8383 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, contains one of the oldest creation narratives from Mesopotamia. The text is fragmentary, damaged by time and rough handling during excavation, but enough survives to reconstruct its outline. It describes the creation of humans by the gods An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhuasaga. After humans are created, the text says, the gods made the small animals that came up from out of the earth come from the earth in abundance. The phrasing is odd, almost recursive. Animals that come up from the earth are made to come from the earth. It suggests a process of manifestation, of something emerging from a source that contains it in potential. Immediately after this line, the text breaks off. We don't know what came next in the original, but the surviving portion establishes a sequence. Gods create humans and animals as simultaneous or near simultaneous acts, both emerging from the earth, both called into existence from a source that precedes them. The earth here is connected to the Abzu, the freshwater underground that Enki governs. So the implication is that both human and animal life come from the same primordial source, the same realm of potential and power. Enki's role in all this is central. He's described in hymns and myths as Lord of the Abzu, Lord of Wisdom, Lord of Magic. He knows the heart of heaven and earth. He possesses understanding that the other gods lack. And crucially, he's the god who teaches humans. In the Eridu Genesis, it's Enki who warns Ziusudra about the flood. In the Adapa myth, it's Enki who creates Adapa and grants him wisdom. In numerous incantations, Enki is invoked as the source of magical knowledge, the one who understands secret names and hidden forces. But, and this is the key point, Enki doesn't invent knowledge, he accesses it. The me exist in the Abzu before Enki retrieves them. The wisdom he teaches to humans comes from somewhere deeper than his own mind. He's a transmitter, not an originator. The texts sometimes describe him pondering in his heart, taking counsel with himself. But what he's pondering is knowledge that already exists. He's figuring out how to apply it, how to transmit it, what to reveal, and what to keep hidden. This structure, knowledge existing prior to and independently of minds, is fundamentally different from modern assumptions about intelligence. We tend to think of knowledge as created through cognitive processes, observation, reasoning, experimentation, abstraction. Minds generate knowledge by engaging with the world. But the Mesopotamian worldview reverses this. Knowledge exists first. Minds are created and then given access to knowledge. The Abzu holds all possible understanding. Gods can enter the Abzu and draw from it. Humans can't enter it directly, so they need intermediaries, Enki, the Apkallu, animal form wisdom keepers, to bring knowledge to the surface. There's a myth called Inanna and Enki that illustrates this. Inanna, goddess of love and war, travels to Eridu and visits Enki in his Abzu sanctuary. Enki, perhaps intoxicated, offers her the me, 94 divine decrees covering everything from kingship to prostitution, from craftsmanship to warfare. Inanna accepts the me and flees back to her city of Uruk before Enki can sober up and reclaim them. The myth is often read as a transfer of power from male to female, or from older to younger deities. But it's also a story about how knowledge moves. The me aren't created by Enki, he possesses them, guards them, keeps them in the Abzu. When they're stolen, he loses something he had, not something he made. This suggests the me are finite, or at least discrete. There are specific pieces of knowledge, specific powers, that can be possessed or transferred. They're more like tools or keys than like ideas. Having the me for kingship doesn't just mean knowing how to rule, it means possessing the authority that makes rulership possible. Having the me for writing doesn't just mean literacy, it means access to the power that makes writing function as a technology of memory and administration. Animals appear in this system in a curious way. Some me are explicitly connected to animals. The me for herding, for instance, governs the domestication and management of livestock. But there are also references to animals possessing attributes that in other contexts are described as me. Birds know navigation, fish know the depths of water, Serpents know the pathways between earth and underworld. This knowing isn't metaphorical. It's treated as real capacity, real intelligence, though of a different order than human intelligence. One tablet from the Old Babylonian period, part of a wisdom text, includes a line that translates roughly as, "The eagle knows the way of the sky, the fish knows the way of the sea, the ant knows the way of the ground." The text is instructing humans to stay within their proper domain, not to overreach. But in doing so, it acknowledges that animals possess domain-specific knowledge, genuine expertise, in their respective realms. The eagle's knowledge of sky isn't inferior to human knowledge of earth. It's different, suited to a different environment. This gets us closer to understanding why the wisdom figures appear in animal form. If knowledge exists in the Abzu, if it's distributed across domains, then the beings who access it must be suited to those domains. Fishmen can navigate between water and land, accessing the knowledge that flows from the Abzu into human cities. Bird-form sages can travel between earth and sky, carrying messages, bridging realms. Serpent gods can descend into the underworld and return, bringing back secrets of death and renewal. Humans, in this cosmology, are stuck on the surface. They can't dive deep enough, fly high enough, burrow far enough to reach the sources of knowledge themselves. They need guides, and those guides necessarily take forms capable of crossing boundaries that humans can't cross. The question then is whether this is all elaborate symbolism, a poetic way of expressing psychological or philosophical truths, or whether it preserves some structural memory of how knowledge actually moved in the deep past. If civilization arrived in Mesopotamia through contact, if skills and ideas came from elsewhere, brought by people who seemed strange, foreign, other than us, then the imagery of animal form teachers might encode that historical reality. The foreigners came from the sea, so they're fish. They came from the mountains, so they're birds. They possessed knowledge that seemed magical, so they're connected to the Abzu, the source of all wisdom. This reading doesn't diminish the myths. It takes them seriously as historical documents, however symbolically encoded. The Sumerians are saying, we didn't invent this. It came from somewhere else. We learned it, and the beings who taught us were different from us, embodied differently, capable of things we couldn't do. The Abzu is the name they gave to that somewhere else, the underground ocean, the realm beneath the world, the place where knowledge waits, timeless, independent of any mind, ready to be drawn to the surface by those who know how to access it. And those who know how to access it, in the beginning, had the bodies of fish and serpents and birds. Humans came later. Humans learned later. Humans built cities and wrote tablets and composed hymns to Enki, praising him for granting wisdom. But the wisdom itself, the content of what was learned, existed before humans existed. It was there in the Abzu. It always had been. The texts don't explain where the Abzu's knowledge comes from. They don't ask that question. For the Sumerians, the Abzu is simply the foundation of reality. It's where things begin. And what begins there before anything else is intelligence. Not human intelligence. Not yet. First intelligence. When the me were not yet human property. There's a term in Sumerian that defies clean translation. Me. It's usually rendered as divine decree or divine power, but those English phrases flatten something more complex. The me are the fundamental building blocks of civilization, the invisible principles that make social order possible. Kingship is a me. Writing is a me. Temple service is a me. But so are prostitution, warfare, music, judgment and destruction. The me encompass everything that structures existence, both creative and destructive, elevated and base. The Sumerian tablets never describe what the me physically look like, but they're clearly represented by objects. They can be carried, stolen, gifted, hidden. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, Inanna loads 94 me onto her boat and sails away with them while Enki's servants chase after her. In ritual texts, priests are described as holding specific me during ceremonies. Temple hymns speak of me as residing in sacred spaces, where their presence maintains cosmic order. The crucial point for our investigation is this: the me exist before humans receive them. They're not human inventions, they're discovered, or more accurately, they're given. And the texts are consistent about where they come from. The Abzu, the underground freshwater realm governed by Enki. This raises a philosophical problem. If the principles governing civilization exist before civilization itself, then civilization isn't invented through trial and error. It's instantiated according to a pre-existing pattern. The Sumerians didn't figure out kingship through gradual political evolution. Kingship descended from heaven as a complete concept, a me that humans implemented but didn't design. The same applies to agriculture, law, metalworking, music. All of it existed as potential in the Abzu, waiting to be brought to the surface and put into practice. The implications are strange. Human culture, in this worldview, isn't a human creation. It's a realization of patterns that precede humanity. People don't innovate, they access. The scribes who developed cuneiform weren't inventing writing, they were recovering the me for writing, bringing it from the Abzu into material form. The architects who built ziggurats weren't designing new structures, they were manifesting the me for sacred architecture, implementing a template that already existed. This is why the teaching figures matter. If civilization is received rather than invented, then someone has to do the receiving. Someone has to access the Abzu, retrieve the me, and transmit them to humans. The Apkallu perform this function, so does Enki. So, in some texts, do animals who possess specific me naturally, without needing to learn them? Consider herding. According to Sumerian cosmology, the me for herding governs the domestication of livestock. But who taught humans to herd? The texts are ambiguous. Some credit the gods directly, but other texts suggest humans learned by observing animals themselves, watching how wild herds organized, how leader animals guided the group, how territory was maintained. If there's a me for herding, and animals already embody that me in their natural behavior, then studying animals means accessing divine knowledge. The animals become living repositories of the me, demonstrating principles humans can learn and apply. This idea appears most clearly in a genre of Sumerian texts called animal proverbs. These are short sayings, often structured as observations about animal behaviour, followed by a moral or practical application. The fox knows the pit it has dug. The raven seeks out what it has hidden. The wild cow does not forget her calf. On the surface, these are simple folk wisdom, but beneath that, there's an assumption. Animals possess knowledge specific to their nature, and humans can learn by paying attention. Some proverbs go further. The dog understands take it, but not put it down. This isn't just about animal training, it's a comment on selective intelligence. The dog grasps one concept, but not its opposite, showing that even limited consciousness can hold genuine understanding. The proverb treats the dog's comprehension as real, not merely instinctual. The dog knows something, even if that knowledge is partial. Cylinder seals from Uruk and Ur depict humans in the presence of animals in ways that suggest more than simple herding or hunting. Some show a figure, possibly a king or priest, standing between two lions, hands resting on their backs, the animals calm. Others show a human seated before a bull, the posture suggesting conversation or consultation. These images might be purely symbolic, representations of dominance or divine favour, but they might also encode older practices, seeking wisdom from animals, learning from observation, treating certain creatures as bearers of knowledge. The instructions of Shurupak, a wisdom text dating to around 2600, contains advice from a father to his son about how to navigate the world. Much of it is practical: don't steal, don't gossip, don't travel at night. But there are also lines like, you should not buy a donkey which brays, it will split your midriff. The warning isn't just about noise. Braying is treated as a sign of temperament, and temperament reflects intelligence. The donkey that brays excessively is unsuitable not because it's physically defective, but because its behaviour reveals a mind that won't cooperate with human purposes. The text attributes intentionality to the animal it chooses to bray, and that choice matters. There's a deeper layer here. If the me for herding exists as a divine principle, then animals who naturally embody that principle, who organise in herds, migrate in patterns, communicate in structured ways, are manifesting divine order without needing human intervention. They possess the me inherently. Humans have to learn it. This makes animals, in a very specific sense, closer to the source. They don't need to access the Abzu because they're already living expressions of what's in the Abzu. This might explain why the wisdom keepers appear in animal form. They're not just messengers delivering knowledge from outside. They are the knowledge, embodied. The fish form of the Apkallu isn't a disguise or a limitation. It's the necessary form for what they carry. Knowledge of water, of depth, of navigation between realms. That knowledge is inseparable from the body that moves through water. Similarly, the serpent form of Ningizida isn't incidental. Knowledge of earth, of renewal, of the boundary between life and death. That knowledge requires a body that touches the ground, that sheds and renews, that can slip between worlds. Humans, lacking these specialised forms, must learn everything. We don't embody the me naturally. We're generalists, capable of receiving many kinds of knowledge, but native to none. This makes us flexible, but also dependent. We need teachers. And in the earliest period, according to the texts, those teachers were beings whose bodies were shaped by the knowledge they carried. There's a moment in the Eridu Genesis where this becomes explicit. After listing the creation of humans and animals, the text describes the founding of the first cities. Each city is assigned to a specific god, and each god brings specific me to that city. Eridu gets the me for purification and sacred knowledge. Bad Tabira gets the me for metalworking. Sippa gets the me for divination and solar observation. The cities don't develop these specializations organically. They're assigned from above, instantiations of pre-existing principles. But who lives in these cities? Humans, yes, but also temple animals, sacred flocks, ritual livestock, creatures kept in sanctuaries, because their presence is necessary for proper worship. The texts describe these animals as belonging to the gods, but they also describe them as essential to the functioning of the me. You can't perform the me for sacrifice without the animals who will be sacrificed. You can't perform the me for herding without the herds themselves. The animals aren't passive resources, they're active participants in the maintenance of divine order. This is why they're preserved in the flood. When Ziusudra loads animals onto the boat, he's not just saving species for future breeding, he's preserving the me themselves, which are embodied in living creatures. If the animals die, the me they carry die with them. The civilization that humans will rebuild after the flood depends on the survival of animal knowledge. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats all of this as myth, interesting for what it reveals about how the Sumerians understood their world, but not as historical testimony. And maybe that's correct. Maybe the me are simply a poetic way of talking about cultural transmission, and the animal imagery is metaphorical. But there's another possibility. The myths preserve structural memory of a time when humans genuinely learned from animals. Not because animals spoke or taught in human ways, but because the skills necessary for survival, tracking, hunting, navigation, seasonal awareness were first demonstrated in animal behaviour. Before humans had language complex enough to transmit knowledge verbally, they watched animals. They saw birds migrating and learnt direction. They saw herds moving to water and learned hydrology. They saw predators hunting in coordinated groups and learned cooperation. The knowledge was there in the world, embodied in creatures who lived it naturally. Humans had to abstract it, name it, systematize it. But the source was animal behaviour, older than human culture, already functioning according to principles that humans would later call the me. If this is the case, then the Sumerian texts aren't fantasies, they're preserved memories, encoded in the vocabulary available to Bronze Age scribes. The Apkallu aren't literal fishmen, they're the memory of learning from creatures who lived in water. The me aren't magical objects, they're the principles that animals demonstrated before humans could articulate them. And the texts, in their strange mythological language, are preserving a truth. Intelligence didn't start with us. We learned it, we received it, we abstracted it from a world where it already existed, lived by creatures who didn't need to name it because they simply were it. Before the me were human property, they belonged to the world, and the world was full of animals. Adappa's refusal and what it means. There's a fragment in the British Museum, part of a larger composition, that tells the story of a man offered immortality who refuses it. His name is Adappa. He's described as the first sage, the wisest of humans, a priest-king of Eridu created by Enki with vast intelligence and understanding. Enki fashions Adappa deliberately, grants him wisdom, speech, perception beyond ordinary human capacity. But Enki does not grant him eternal life. The story begins with Adappa fishing in the Persian Gulf. The south wind capsizes his boat and hurls him into the water. Furious, Adappa curses the wind and breaks its wing, rendering it powerless. For 7 days, the wind doesn't blow across the land. The sky god Anu notices the disruption and summons Adappa to explain himself. Before Adappa ascends to heaven, Enki gives him counsel. He warns that Anu will offer food and drink, and that Adappa must refuse. The food and drink, Enki says, are the food and drink of death, poison meant to punish Adappa for breaking the wind's wing. Enki instructs Adappa to accept clothing and oil if offered, but to touch neither food nor water. Adappa trusts Enki. Enki is his father god, his creator, the source of his wisdom. Why would Enki lie? Adappa ascends. He flatters the guardians at Heaven's Gate, Tammuz and Geshida, the dying and reviving gods. They speak favourably of him to Anu. When Anu questions Adappa about the south wind, Adappa explains he was fishing to provide offerings for Enki's temple, the wind destroyed his boat, and in anger he retaliated. Anu, impressed by Adappa's intelligence and eloquence, responds not with punishment, but with reward. He orders the food and water of life brought to Adappa, the gift of immortality, the chance to become like the gods. But Adappa, remembering Enki's warning, refuses. Anu is baffled. "Come, Adappa, why have you not eaten, not drunk? Now you shall not live." Adappa explains, "Enki, my lord, told me not to eat, not to drink." Anu realizes what has happened. Enki has deceived his own creation, ensuring that humanity remains mortal. Anu sends Adappa back to earth. The third tablet of the myth, which is fragmentary, seems to describe Anu punishing Enki for the deception, but the details are lost. Why does Enki do this? The text doesn't explicitly say, but the structure suggests an answer. Humans are created to serve the gods, to maintain temples, to provide offerings, to labour in ways that free divine beings from work. If humans become immortal, they become equals. The hierarchy collapses. Enki, having granted intelligence to humans, must prevent them from acquiring the second gift that would complete their divinity. Intelligence is acceptable, immortality is not. Humans can be wise, but they must remain mortal. This is the same structure as Genesis 3, where Yahweh casts Adam and Eve from Eden, not for eating from the tree of knowledge, but to prevent them from eating from the tree of life. "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life." The threat isn't disobedience, it's equality. Knowledge plus immortality equals godhood. One is tolerable, both are unacceptable. But the Mesopotamian version is stranger. In Genesis, Adam and Eve act independently. They choose to eat the forbidden fruit, defying divine command. In the Adappa myth, The human doesn't defy anyone. He's obedient, he trusts his creator, and his creator lies to him deliberately to keep him mortal. Adapa is granted wisdom, but denied eternity. He can think, understand, perceive the structure of reality. Enki makes him know the heart of heaven and earth, a phrase suggesting comprehension of cosmic order. But that knowledge doesn't include awareness of his own limitations. Adapa doesn't realise he's being deceived until it's too late. His wisdom isn't complete, it's selectively granted, shaped by the intentions of the god who fashioned him. This has implications for how the Sumerians understood intelligence. Wisdom isn't a unified thing. It can be partitioned, divided, granted in pieces. Adapa receives enough wisdom to serve Enki effectively, but not enough to achieve autonomy. He's an instrument of divine will, extraordinarily sophisticated, but still an instrument. And when his wisdom threatens to carry him beyond his designated role, when Anu offers him immortality, the system intervenes. The story casts doubt on the benevolence of the knowledge transmission process. Earlier texts present the Apkallu, Enki, and other wisdom bringers as teachers, gifts to humanity, sources of civilization. But the Adapa myth complicates this. If the gods control access to knowledge, they also control its limits. Humans receive what serves divine purposes, not necessarily what serves human flourishing. The wisdom humans possess is curated wisdom, filtered through the intentions of beings who want humans wise enough to be useful, but not wise enough to be free. This returns us to the animal question. If humans are created and granted selective wisdom, what about the Apkallu? They're described as servants of Enki, agents who transmit knowledge under divine supervision. Do they have autonomy, or are they instruments too? The texts don't address this directly, but the structure suggests they're intermediaries, more independent than humans, less so than gods. Their fish form might represent their intermediate status, capable of moving between realms, but bound to neither, existing in service to a system they didn't create. Animals in the Mesopotamian worldview occupy a similar position. They embody divine principles, the me, but they don't control them. A herd animal follows migration patterns set by seasonal rhythms, patterns that reflect cosmic order, but the animal doesn't choose the pattern, it simply is the pattern. This makes animals, in one sense, perfect expressions of divine will, uncontaminated by autonomy, pure embodiments of order. Humans, by contrast, have enough independence to disobey, and that independence is the problem. Enki can't simply create humans as perfect servants the way he might create an animal species optimized for a specific function. Humans need wisdom to perform complex tasks, but wisdom brings the capacity for independent action. So Enki creates Adapa with wisdom, but withholds eternity, ensuring that even the wisest human remains temporary, mortal, ultimately subordinate. The myth suggests a hierarchy of intelligence. At the bottom, animals embody divine order without awareness. Above them, humans possess awareness, but limited understanding and no immortality. Above humans, the Apkallu and intermediate beings possess greater understanding and teach humans but serve divine purposes. At the top, gods possess full understanding and immortality, and they control the entire system. But this hierarchy is unstable. Adapa nearly escapes. If he had ignored Enki's warning and eaten the food of life, he would have become like a god, wise and eternal, fully autonomous. The fact that he came so close reveals a vulnerability in the system. Intelligence, once granted, can lead to outcomes the grantor didn't intend, which raises a question: what if, in the deep past, something went wrong? What if some beings, whether the Apkallu or others, possessed wisdom beyond what the gods intended? What if the fish-form sages were not merely servants, but something more autonomous, carriers of knowledge that exceeded their designated role? The texts don't pursue this line of thinking. They maintain divine control, divine intention, divine hierarchy, but the cracks are visible. Adapa is deceived because his wisdom is incomplete, but the gods clearly fear what would happen if his wisdom became complete. The Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies, demonstrating that even non-human beings can challenge divine order. The flood is sent to destroy humanity, suggesting that humans, or something associated with humanity, had exceeded acceptable limits. Reading these texts closely, one senses a pattern. Knowledge is powerful, dangerous, and difficult to control. The gods grant it selectively, but once granted, it moves in unpredictable ways. Humans learn from the Apkallu, but then they start teaching each other, and the transmission becomes uncontrollable. The Mi are supposed to maintain order, but they can also be stolen, lost, misused. And animals, in this system, represent the ideal that gods wish humans would emulate. Intelligent enough to function, but not autonomous enough to rebel. Animals embody knowledge without questioning it. They demonstrate divine order without threatening it. They're what humans might have been if Enki had created us as perfect servants, rather than as beings capable of asking why we exist. Adopa's refusal is tragic, but it's also revealing. He could have transcended. He could have become immortal, like the flood hero Ziusudra, who also meets the gods and is granted eternal life. But Adapa trusts the wrong voice, follows the wrong counsel, and remains bound to earth and death. The question is whether this outcome is accidental, Enki making a mistake, inadvertently sabotaging his own creation, or whether it's intentional, a deliberate act to preserve hierarchy, to ensure that humans never become fully equal to gods. If intentional, then the knowledge humans possess is, by design, insufficient. We're smart enough to build cities and write hymns and perform rituals, but we're not smart enough to escape mortality. Our wisdom is bounded, limited, controlled. And the beings who taught us, the fishmen, the serpent gods, the bird-form sages, were they teaching us to transcend or teaching us to remain in place? The texts don't answer, but Adapa's refusal lingers as a warning. Intelligence is not freedom. Knowledge is not power unless it's complete. And completeness, according to the gods, is reserved for those who don't need to be human. The flood tablets and the animals who knew. In the museum basement, there's another fragment worth examining. It's part of tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, catalogue number K3375, in the British Museum, discovered in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh in the 19th century. The tablet describes the flood from a later perspective, Babylonian rather than Sumerian, but it preserves details that connect directly to the older Eridu Genesis text we started with. And what it preserves, in ways the earlier text hints at, but doesn't fully develop, is the role of animals in the survival of knowledge across the catastrophe. Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for the flood hero, equivalent to the Sumerian Ziusudra, is telling Gilgamesh about how he survived the deluge. The god Akkadian name for Enki warns him through a dream, speaking through the reed wall of his house, so that technically he's not violating the god's decree to keep the flood secret. Ea instructs Utnapishtim to dismantle his house, use its materials to build a boat, and load onto it the seed of all living things. The phrase is crucial, the seed of all living things. Not just breeding pairs for future livestock, but something broader, representatives of animal life whose continuation is essential for the world's restoration. The text specifies measurements for the boat, construction details, the coating of pitch inside and out. Then it describes the loading process. Utnapishtim brings his family, his craftsmen and their families, his possessions. But before the human passengers board, he brings the animals. All I had of the seed of all living creatures I loaded aboard. The sequence matters. Animals first, humans second. As if the animals are more essential, more primary, more necessary for what comes next. The flood itself is described with visceral intensity. The storm breaks at dawn, thunder rolls through the darkness, dikes collapse, rivers surge backward. The Anunnaki, the great gods, lift torches, illuminating the sky with lightning. The storm god Adad rides across heaven, his voice shattering the earth. For 6 days and 7 nights the tempest rages. On the seventh day, the storm exhausts itself, the sea calms, and the boat comes to rest on Mount Nisir. Utnapishtim waits. Then he opens a hatch and releases a dove. The dove flies out, circles, finds nowhere to land, and returns. He releases a swallow. It also returns. Finally, he releases a raven. The raven flies out, finds carrion floating on the water, eats, and doesn't return. Utnapishtim knows the waters have receded enough for life to resume. This moment, the release of birds to test the world's readiness, appears in flood narratives across cultures. Biblical Noah does the same thing. But there's a layer of meaning here that's easy to miss. The birds aren't just scouts, they're knowledge carriers. Their ability to navigate, to search, to find land when humans trapped in the boat can't see beyond the horizon, this ability demonstrates intelligence. Not human intelligence, but intelligence nonetheless. The raven makes a choice. It doesn't return because it finds food, because the new world offers what it needs. The decision is autonomous. The bird acts in its own interest, and that action provides information Utnapishtim couldn't obtain any other way. The animals in this reading aren't passengers, they're agents. Their survival isn't incidental, it's necessary. The text treats their knowledge, their capacity to navigate, perceive, evaluate the environment, as complementary to human knowledge. Utnapishtim possesses the wisdom to build the boat and seal it with pitch. The raven possesses the wisdom to search the world and recognize habitability. Both kinds of wisdom are needed. After the flood, Utnapishtim makes sacrifice. He slaughters animals, burns offerings, sets up vessels of incense. The gods, who have been hiding in heaven terrified by the storm's violence, smell the sweet savour and gather around the sacrifice like flies. They're hungry, they need the offerings, and the offerings come from animals whose survival Utnapishtim ensured. This creates a dependency. The gods destroyed the world, but they depend on humans and animals to restore the ritual order that sustains them. Without animals, there are no sacrifices. Without sacrifices, the gods starve, not literally, but symbolically, severed from the connection that gives their existence meaning. The flood was meant to annihilate humanity's noise and chaos, but it also annihilated the worship system. Allowing Utnapishtim and the animals to survive means allowing that system to resume. Enlil, the god who decreed the flood, arrives late to the sacrifice. When he sees the boat and realizes humans survived, he's furious. But Ea confronts him. How could you, without thinking, bring on this flood? On the sinner impose his sin, on the transgressor impose his transgression. The argument is that collective punishment was unjust. Some humans, like Utnapishtim, were righteous and deserved to live. Enlil calms down, boards the boat, and grants Utnapishtim and his wife immortality as reward for their service. But notice, the animals receive no such reward. They're not punished for surviving, but they're not honoured either. They simply continue existing, embodying their nature, fulfilling their function. They restore the herds, repopulate the wild, become once again the foundation for human agriculture and divine sacrifice. Their knowledge, the knowledge that allowed them to survive aboard the boat, the knowledge the raven demonstrated when it chose not to return, is taken for granted, invisible, essential, but unacknowledged. The Eridu Genesis version, CBS 10673, emphasises this even more. When Ziusudra emerges from the boat after the flood, the text says he disembarks the small animals that come up from the earth. The phrasing echoes the creation narrative earlier in the same text, where animals came up from out of the earth when the world was first made. The repetition suggests a cycle: creation, flood, recreation. And in both creation and recreation, animals emerge as essential components of the world's structure. Why does this matter for our investigation into animal intelligence? Because the flood narratives treat animal survival not as a logistical detail, but as a cosmic necessity. The world can't be restored without them. Not just because humans need livestock, but because the animals themselves carry something that can't be replaced. The texts don't specify what that something is, but the structure implies it's more than biological. It's related to order, to knowledge, to the me that govern existence. If animals embody the me, if herds naturally demonstrate the principles of herding, if migratory birds naturally demonstrate navigation, if predators naturally demonstrate cooperative hunting, then their extinction would mean the loss of those principles. The me might exist abstractly in the Abzu, but they need physical instantiation to function. Animals are that instantiation. Killing all animals would sever the connection between abstract divine order and material reality. This is why Enki, god of wisdom, is the one who ensures animal survival. He warns Utnapishtim to load the boat specifically with the seed of all living things. He's not just preserving biodiversity, he's preserving the me themselves. Each species carries a fragment of divine knowledge, and if that species dies, the knowledge dies with it. There's a theological implication here that the texts don't fully explore, but which hovers beneath the surface. Gods need animals. Not for food, gods don't require physical sustenance, but for manifestation. The divine principles that gods represent can only exist in the world through physical embodiment. Herding only exists if there are herds. Flight only exists if there are birds. Predation only exists if there are predators. Remove the embodiments and the principles become abstract, powerless, disconnected from reality. Humans participate in this system, but we don't originate it. We herd the animals, but they demonstrate herding first. We navigate by observing bird migration, but the birds possess the knowledge inherently. We hunt cooperatively because we watched wolves and learned. The knowledge comes from observation, from interaction with creatures who already live the principles we're trying to learn. The flood, then, is a test of the system's resilience. Can divine order survive catastrophe? Can knowledge persist through destruction? The answer is yes, but only if the carriers of knowledge survive. And those carriers aren't just human. They're animal, vegetable, mineral. The whole structure of the world participates in the preservation of the me. Some scholars read the flood narratives as punishment stories, or as mythological explanations for ancient geological events. Others see them as moral allegories about divine justice and human responsibility. But there's another way to read them, as narratives about knowledge transmission across temporal boundaries. Before the flood, civilization exists. The flood destroys it. After the flood, civilization resumes, but not from scratch. The survivors bring knowledge with them. They remember how to build, how to plant, how to worship, and they have the animals who remember how to herd, how to migrate, how to hunt. Memory is distributed across species. Not all knowledge is held by humans. Some of it lives in animal behaviour, animal instinct, animal intelligence. And when the world needs to be restored, that distributed knowledge becomes crucial. Utnapishtim can't rebuild alone. He needs the animals he saved. Their continuation ensures that the principles they embody survive. This is why the texts treat animal survival as non-negotiable. It's not compassion, it's cosmic necessity. The world functions through the interaction of multiple forms of intelligence, multiple carriers of knowledge. Remove any of them and the system collapses. And the system, according to these texts, is older than humanity. The animals were present at creation, they survived the flood. They continue existing through every upheaval, carrying knowledge forward, demonstrating divine order, ensuring that the me remain connected to the world. Humans write the tablets, but the animals live the wisdom the tablets describe. And when the tablets are lost, when cities fall, when libraries burn, when civilizations collapse, the animals remain. That's the lesson of the flood narratives. Not that humans are special, chosen, saved by gods who favour us, but that we're one species among many, dependent on the survival of the whole, carriers of knowledge we didn't invent and can't sustain alone. Before the cities rose, animals knew. After the flood erased those cities, animals still knew. And in the present, if we're honest, they still know things we've forgotten. Creatures of Tiamat and primordial intelligence. Long before the gods organised the cosmos, according to the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, there was chaos, or more precisely, there was mixture. Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, mingled together in undifferentiated unity. From that mixture, the first gods emerged. And as those gods multiplied, they created noise, disturbance, disruption. Apsu decided to destroy them. But Ea killed Apsu first, establishing himself atop the freshwater Apsu, claiming dominion over the source of wisdom. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, decided to wage war on the younger gods, and for that war she created monsters. Tablet first of the Enuma Elish describes them. She spawned monster serpents, sharp of tooth and merciless of fang. With poison instead of blood she filled their bodies. Roaring dragons she clothed with terror, crowned them with halos, made them like gods. 11 creatures total: serpents, dragons, storm demons, a sphinx, a centaur-like creature, others whose forms are difficult to reconstruct from the fragmentary descriptions. These weren't animals in the normal sense. They were primordial beings born from chaos itself, existing before the order that would later define species and categories. Tiamat appointed one of them, Kingu, as their leader. She gave him the Tablet of Destinies, the object that grants authority over the me, over the structure of reality itself. With the tablet, Kingu and the 11 creatures threatened to undo creation, to return the cosmos to undifferentiated chaos. The younger gods were terrified. None of them could face Tiamat and her army. Finally Marduk, son of Ea, offered to fight on one condition. If he won, he would be made king of the gods, supreme authority over all. The gods agreed. Marduk armed himself, rode a storm, and confronted Tiamat. After a tremendous battle, he killed her, split her corpse in half, and used the pieces to create the heavens and the earth. He reclaimed the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu, executed him, and mixed Kingu's blood with clay to create humanity. This is the canonical story. But there's a detail that's easy to overlook. Before they were defeated, Tiamat's 11 creatures weren't mindless. They were intelligent. They wielded authority. They carried the Tablet of Destinies. They represented an alternative order, a possible structure for reality that would have functioned according to different principles than the one Marduk established. The text describes them as gods, or godlike, but their forms are animal, serpents, dragons, beasts, and they existed before the current divine order, before the organisation of heaven and earth, before humans were created. In the timeline of the myth, they represent the earliest embodied intelligence, the first beings with agency, with will, with the capacity to wage war and claim authority. They lost. Marduk defeated them. But what happened to them after the battle? The text says Marduk bound them, chained them, and made them serve the gods. They weren't destroyed, they were subordinated. Their power was redirected, channeled into service of the new order, and some interpretations suggest they became the models for the hybrid creatures, fishmen, bullmen, lion demons, that appear in later Mesopotamian art and ritual as protective figures. If this reading is correct, then the Apkallu might be descended from or connected to Tiamat's creatures. Fish-bodied, intelligent, older than the organised cosmos, possessing knowledge of primordial order, they were redeemed, integrated into the system Marduk established, transformed from enemies into teachers. Their original chaos nature was tamed, but their intelligence remained, and that intelligence became the foundation for human civilization. This adds a darker shade to the narrative. The wisdom humans receive doesn't come from gods who benevolently decided to teach. It comes from creatures of chaos who were defeated, bound, and forced into service. The Apkallu aren't voluntary teachers, they're compelled teachers, Agents of an older order now subordinate to the new one. Their fish bodies mark them as remnants of Tiamat, the primal ocean whose death made creation possible. What does this mean for understanding animal intelligence in Mesopotamian thought? It suggests that intelligence, in its earliest form, wasn't orderly or benevolent. It was wild, chaotic, dangerous. Tiamat's creatures possessed minds, but those minds were dedicated to war, destruction, the undoing of divine plans. Their intelligence threatened the cosmos itself. Only after they were defeated and bound could their knowledge be harnessed, transformed into something constructive. This pattern, wild intelligence that must be tamed before it becomes useful, appears throughout Mesopotamian mythology. The Anzu bird steals the tablet of destinies and must be defeated by Ninurta. Humbaba, the forest guardian, is killed by Gilgamesh. Wild animals must be domesticated, their autonomous intelligence subordinated to human purposes before they can contribute to civilization. The recurring theme is that intelligence exists independently in the world, but it's dangerous until it's controlled. This creates a tension. On one hand, the texts honour intelligence wherever it appears, in gods, humans, animals, even chaos monsters. Intelligence is valuable, necessary, the foundation of order. On the other hand, intelligence that's autonomous, that acts according to its own will, rather than serving the system, is treated as a threat. Tiamat's creatures are intelligent, but their intelligence is deployed against the gods, so they must be defeated. The Apkallu are intelligent, but their intelligence is directed by Enki, so they're beneficial. The difference isn't the capacity for thought, it's the direction of loyalty. Humans fit into this system uneasily. We possess intelligence, but that intelligence was created from the blood of Kingu, the chaos creature. According to the Enuma Elish, Marduk creates humans specifically to serve the gods, to perform labour so the gods can rest. Human intelligence is designed intelligence, shaped for a purpose, but it derives from chaos, the blood of a rebel mixed with clay from the earth, animated by divine breath. We're hybrids, in a sense, part divine intention, part primordial rebellion. This might explain why humans are so often depicted alongside animal form guides and teachers. We're not stable on our own. Our intelligence came from chaos and could return to chaos. We need the Apkallu, the protective demons, the hybrid guardians, to keep us oriented toward order. The animal forms of these teachers remind us that intelligence predates us, that it existed in the world before humans were created, and that it continues existing in forms that don't answer to us. The 11 creatures of Tiamat, if they're the ancestors of the hybrid protective beings, represent a genealogy of intelligence that's older and stranger than human consciousness. They were born from the body of chaos itself. They wielded divine authority before Marduk organised the cosmos. They lost their war, but they didn't lose their minds. They were integrated into the system, their knowledge repurposed, their forms adapted to serve rather than destroy. And their descendants, the fishmen, birdmen, bullmen, serpent guardians, became essential to human civilization. Not because humans couldn't survive without them, but because human intelligence alone isn't sufficient to maintain cosmic order. We need reminders that we're part of a larger system, that our knowledge is derivative, that the structure we inhabit was established by defeating creatures who represented an older structure. This is a fundamentally different way of thinking about intelligence than modern frameworks allow. We tend to assume intelligence is good, benevolent, leading toward progress and flourishing, but Mesopotamian texts treat intelligence as neutral, powerful, dangerous, only beneficial when aligned with order. The creatures of Tiamat were intelligent and terrible. The Apkallu are intelligent and helpful. The difference isn't their capacity for thought, it's their role in the system. Animals, in this worldview, can possess intelligence that's either aligned with order or disruptive to it. Wild animals threaten human settlements, but they also embody principles that humans need to learn. Domesticated animals serve human purposes, but they lose something in the process: the autonomous wildness that made them expressions of primordial power. The flood narratives preserve animals not just for practical reasons, but because their wildness is essential. Without wild animals, the world becomes too domesticated, too controlled, severed from the chaos that underlies creation. The me depend on a balance between order and disorder. Too much chaos and civilization collapses. Too much order and the system stagnates, losing its connection to the vitality that made creation possible. Tiamat's creatures, even in defeat, guarantee that chaos never fully disappears. They're bound, integrated, serving the gods, but they remember what they were, and that memory, passed down through the hybrid forms of protective demons and wisdom teachers, ensures that humans never forget intelligence existed before us, in shapes that terrified the gods themselves. We didn't invent minds. We inhabit a world where minds already existed, where intelligence took myriad forms, where the first beings to think and plan and wage war were creatures born from primordial waters, serpent-bodied, crowned with terror, sharp of tooth, and merciless of fang. Order defeated them, but their intelligence survived, transformed into the teachers who gave humans civilization. And somewhere in that transformation, animal form and divine knowledge became inseparable, not because animals are primitive and intelligence is advanced, but because the intelligence that built the world wore scales and wings first, before it ever learned to speak in human language. Shurupak's instructions and the memory problem. There's a puzzle embedded in one of the oldest wisdom texts from Mesopotamia, the Instructions of Shurupak. The text presents itself as advice from Shurupak, a king of the antediluvian city of Shurupak, to his son Ziusudra, the same Ziusudra who will later survive the flood. The instructions are practical, earthy, concerned with how to navigate social relationships, avoid trouble, accumulate wealth, maintain reputation. But there's something strange about the text's existence. If Shurupak is speaking to Ziusudra before the flood, and Ziusudra survives the flood while everyone else dies, then the only way this text can exist after the flood is if Ziusudra remembered it and transmitted it to his descendants, which means every copy of the Instructions of Shurupak, and there are dozens, found at sites across Mesopotamia, spanning more than 1,000 years, descends from Ziusudra's memory of his father's words. This is narratively significant. The text itself acknowledges it's preserving pre-flood knowledge, and the knowledge it preserves isn't cosmic or theological, it's mundane. Don't buy a braying donkey. Don't vouch for someone else's debt. Don't marry a woman you met at a festival. These are the lessons of practical experience, accumulated over generations of trial and error, refined into memorable maxims. This is cultural knowledge, how to live skillfully in a complex social world. And according to the text's own framing, this knowledge predates the flood. It comes from the old world. It was preserved through catastrophe and transmitted to the new world. Ziusudra carried it across the boundary, remembered it, taught it to his children, who taught it to their children, until eventually scribes at Nippur in the early 2nd millennium BC were copying it onto clay tablets that would be buried and forgotten and excavated 4,000 years later by archaeologists from Philadelphia. This is how knowledge survives, through memory, transmission, replication, preservation. And the text is explicit that the knowledge it contains is old, older than the cities where it's being copied, older than the dynasties of historical kings. It's antediluvian knowledge brought forward into the post-flood world. But here's the problem. If Shurupak's wisdom is preserved through Zisudra's memory, what else did Zisudra remember? What else survived from the old world, carried in the mind of the flood hero, passed down through oral tradition before being committed to writing? The Sumerian king list says Shurupak ruled in the 5th and final antediluvian city. His reign is listed as 18,600 years, the same impossible chronology applied to other early kings. Ziusudra succeeds him as king of Shuruppak. Though his reign length isn't specified, the flood interrupts the sequence before the text can record it. The pairing of Shuruppak and Ziusudra in both the king list and the instructions creates a narrative continuity, father and son, teacher and student, old world and new. The flood marks the boundary. Before it, the world functioned according to one set of principles: long-lived kings, direct interaction with gods, the Apkallu teaching humans, cities founded by divine decree. After it, the world operates differently. Reign lengths become plausible, divine interaction becomes mediated, humans must figure things out more independently. The Instructions of Shuruppak is one of the few texts that explicitly bridges this boundary, presenting itself as wisdom from the old world that remains valid in the new. But there's another layer. Some versions of the instructions include references to animals, not just as resources or metaphors, but as teachers. The fox knows the pit it has dug. The raven seeks out what it has hidden. These aren't just observations. They're examples of animal intelligence, presented as worth studying, learning from, emulating. The text doesn't say humans invented cleverness and then projected it onto animals. It says animals demonstrate cleverness and humans should pay attention. If Shuruppak, living in the antediluvian world, is teaching his son to learn from animals, then animal intelligence is part of the pre-flood knowledge that survives the catastrophe. It's not a later development, something humans figured out after civilization resumed. It's primordial knowledge, remembered from the old world. This aligns with the pattern we've been tracing. In the earliest period, humans learn from beings who appear in animal form, the Apkallu, the serpent gods, the great birds. Civilization is transmitted, not invented. And part of what's transmitted is the idea that intelligence exists in multiple forms, that humans aren't the sole carriers of knowledge, that wisdom can be found by observing creatures whose minds work differently than ours. The Instructions of Shuruppak preserves this worldview. It treats animals as worthy of attention, respect, even emulation in certain contexts, and it does so in a text that's framed as originating before the flood, before human civilization as we know it began. The memory problem then is this: if the text is genuinely old, if it preserves traditions from the deepest layers of Mesopotamian culture, then the view of animal intelligence it presents isn't a later accretion, a folksy addition by later scribes. It's foundational. It's part of the knowledge that survived from the beginning. And if it's foundational, then the Mesopotamian worldview never assumed human intellectual superiority. From the start, from the texts that claim to originate before the flood, there's acknowledgement that animals know things, that their knowledge is real and valuable, that humans benefit from paying attention to it. This isn't sentimentality or nature worship, it's pragmatic. The fox knows where it buried food, therefore be as careful as a fox about where you store resources. The raven doesn't return to a place where it found nothing, therefore don't waste time on unprofitable endeavours. The donkey that brays excessively won't work well, therefore choose animals, and by extension, companions based on temperament and demonstrated behaviour, not appearance. The text is teaching discernment, pattern recognition, the ability to read behaviour and infer intention. And it's teaching these skills by pointing to animals who already possess them. Animals become case studies, examples, demonstrations of principles that humans must learn to apply. Shuruppak in the old world understood this. He taught it to Ziusudra. Ziusudra survived the flood and taught it to his descendants. And now, 4,000 years after the texts were written, we're reading the same advice. Watch animals. They know things. Learn from them. The fact that this knowledge is framed as antediluvian is crucial. It means the Mesopotamians didn't think of animal intelligence as a recent discovery or a metaphorical convenience. They thought of it as ancient, essential, part of the foundation on which civilization rests. Before cities, before writing, before organised religion, there was observation, watching animals, learning from their behaviour, abstracting principles that could be applied to human life. The Instructions of Shuruppak is a memory of that process, and the fact that it survived, that scribes kept copying it, students kept studying it, generation after generation across more than a millennium, suggests they believed it preserved something irreplaceable. Not just practical advice, but a way of seeing the world, a recognition that intelligence is older than us, that it existed before us, that we learned by watching beings who already knew. Ziusudra carried this knowledge through the flood. He remembered his father's instructions. He taught them to his children. The text moved from memory to speech, to writing to preservation. And what it preserved, among many other things, was the idea that humans don't have a monopoly on mind. Before the flood, animals were worth learning from. After the flood, they still are. And the reason we know this is because someone remembered, across catastrophe, across the boundary between old world and new, that wisdom takes many forms. Not all of them human. Not then, not now. The pattern across sources. Let's take inventory. We've examined the Eridugenesis, CBS 10673, which describes the creation of humans and animals in parallel, the founding of cities by divine decree, and the flood that preserves both human and animal life as essential for the world's restoration. We've looked at the Sumerian king list, WB 444, which records antediluvian kings ruling for impossible durations, paired with Apkallu sages who teach civilization. We've explored the Apkallu tradition itself, fish-bodied beings who rose from the sea and transmitted knowledge that humans didn't possess, knowledge of writing, mathematics, astronomy, magic, law. We've considered animal form deities, Ningazida, the serpent god guarding wisdom, the Anzu bird who stole divine knowledge and had to be defeated, Dumuzi the shepherd, whose intimate relationship with animals marked him as sacred. We've examined the concept of the Abzu, the underground ocean, where all knowledge resides prior to its manifestation in the world, and the Me, divine principles that govern existence, some of which are embodied naturally in animal behaviour without needing to be taught. We've read the Adapa myth, where human intelligence is selectively granted and deliberately limited by the god who creates it, and where immortality is withheld to preserve hierarchy. We've traced the flood narratives, Eridugenesis, Atrahasis, Gilgamesh Tablet C, which consistently emphasise that animal survival is cosmically necessary, not just practically convenient, and that animals possess knowledge humans depend on but can't replicate. We've looked at the Enuma Elish, where primordial creatures of chaos possess intelligence before the cosmos is organised, and where their descendants become the hybrid protectors and wisdom teachers that guard human civilization. And we've examined the Instructions of Shuruppak, a text that frames itself as preserving pre-flood knowledge, including the principle that animals demonstrate wisdom worth learning from. Each text comes from a different period. The Eridugenesis and parts of the Sumerian king list are early dynastic or Old Babylonian, roughly 2600–1600 BC. The Instructions of Shuruppak might be even older, with traditions reaching back into the 4th millennium. The Adapa myth exists in multiple versions from the mid-2nd millennium. Gilgamesh Tablet C, in its standard version, dates to around 1300–1000 BC. The Enuma Elish is late Old Babylonian or early Kassite, around 1800–1600 BCE. Cylinder seals and temple carvings depicting the Apkallu and other hybrid figures span more than 2,000 years. These texts weren't composed by the same scribes, in the same cities, for the same purposes. They're drawn from different genres: creation myths, king lists, wisdom literature, epic poetry, ritual incantations, protective spells. They reflect the perspectives of different regions, different periods, different political contexts, and yet they share a pattern. Intelligence in all of these sources originates outside humanity. It exists before humans are created. It resides in the Abzu, the primordial source. It's carried by beings who aren't human, gods yes, but also intermediate figures who bridge the gap between divine and human, and whose forms are animal. Fishmen, serpents, birds. Hybrid creatures with the bodies of beasts and the minds of sages. These beings teach. They transmit. They make knowledge accessible to humans, who receive it but don't generate it. The Apkallu teach writing and city building. Ningazida guards healing knowledge. The Anzu, even in stealing the Tablet of Destinies, demonstrates that non-human intelligence can comprehend and manipulate the cosmic order. Animals aboard the Ark preserve the me across the flood's destruction, ensuring that the principles governing existence survive into the new world. Humans are latecomers. We're created after the cosmos is organised, after the gods have established the basic structure of reality. Our role is to maintain that structure, to cultivate the earth, perform rituals, provide offerings, build temples. We're given enough intelligence to do these tasks effectively, but that intelligence is derivative. It comes from outside, transmitted by teachers whose bodies mark them as other than human. The texts don't present this as a deficit. There's no shame in being taught, no embarrassment about not inventing civilization independently. Instead, there's a kind of humility, an acknowledgement that humans are part of a larger order, that we depend on knowledge we didn't create, that our wisdom is borrowed. But there's also something unsettling about the pattern. If intelligence is transmitted from above, from gods through intermediate beings to humans, then humans don't control the process. We receive what we're given, and we don't receive everything. Adapa is granted wisdom but denied immortality. The Apkallu transmits specific me but not others. The gods decide what knowledge is safe for humans to possess. This raises questions about autonomy. How much of human civilization reflects our choices, and how much reflects the intentions of those who taught us? If we're implementing a template that precedes us, executing instructions we received from beings we didn't fully understand, then in what sense are we free? The animal figures complicate this. They're not gods, not fully autonomous. But they're not tools either. They possess intelligence, memory, agency. They choose whether to return to the boat or fly away. They embody me that humans must learn. They demonstrate principles that even gods respect. Their intermediate status between divine and human, between autonomous and subordinate, makes them more relatable than the gods, more accessible as models. We can observe animals in ways we can't observe gods. We can learn from their behaviour in real time, without needing revelation or visionary experience. They're part of our world, living alongside us, yet they possess knowledge we don't have. This creates a pedagogy. Watch animals. They show you how herds function, how navigation works, how cooperation enables predation, how territory is maintained, how cycles of growth and decay operate. The me aren't abstract, they're embodied, and the bodies that embody them are often animal. So when the Sumerians say civilization was taught by fishmen who rose from the sea, they might be preserving memory of a more complex process. Not literal fishmen, but a recognition that knowledge came from observation of creatures who already lived according to the principles humans needed to learn. The fish form would represent that origin, wisdom from water, from the Abzu, from the source, carried by beings whose bodies are suited to that realm. Similarly, when the texts say the Anzu bird tried to steal the Tablet of Destinies, they might be encoding a memory of birds as symbols of knowledge that flies beyond human reach, that must be pursued, captured, brought down to earth before humans can use it. The bird's theft represents the difficulty of accessing knowledge that exists but isn't readily available. Ninurta's victory represents successful acquisition, the me are retrieved, integrated into the system, made to serve divine purposes. The serpent form of wisdom gods like Ningazida would encode the idea that some knowledge lives underground, in darkness, in the underworld of death and renewal, and that accessing it requires descending, confronting fear, bringing back what was hidden. Serpents shed their skin and seem reborn. This makes them symbols of transformation, of knowledge that changes the knower. Each animal form corresponds to a domain of knowledge, a way of accessing the me, a pedagogical method. Fishwater goss source-luck origin, bird sky transcendence sluck navigation, serpent earth underworld hidden things, transformation, bull strength what labour call agricultural surplus. lion texts, predation texts, kingship texts, controlled violence. Humans don't possess these forms naturally. We must learn the lessons each form teaches. And in learning, we construct civilization, not from nothing, but from principles we observe, abstract, and implement. This reading doesn't require us to believe fishmen existed. It requires us to take seriously the structure of the myths. Knowledge existed before us, was carried by forms different from ours, and was transmitted through observation and instruction rather than spontaneous invention. The pattern is consistent across sources because it reflects something real about how cultures develop. Knowledge accumulates. It's transmitted between generations, between groups, between species, in the sense that humans learn from observing animals. It moves through trade, conquest, migration, intermarriage, education, imitation. And when people try to understand where their knowledge came from, they create origin stories. The Sumerian origin stories don't say humans invented everything. They say humans received, learned, were taught. The teachers appear in forms that mark them as other: gods, demigods, hybrid creatures, animals. This otherness is the point. If the teachers were human, the story would be less interesting, less memorable, less true to the experience of learning from sources that seem alien, strange, initially incomprehensible. So the pattern we see across all these sources isn't coincidence or narrative convention. It's the Mesopotamian way of saying, this came from outside us. We didn't make it up. It was here before us, embodied in forms we had to learn to recognize, transmitted by beings we had to learn to understand. And the oldest of those forms, the ones closest to the source, were animal. 3 ways to read the evidence. So far we've mapped the territory, traced the pattern across tablets, myths, king lists, wisdom literature, flood narratives, creation epics. We've seen how Sumerian texts consistently describe intelligence as originating outside humanity, transmitted by beings in animal form, embodied in creatures who precede and transcend human consciousness. Now we need to confront what this pattern might mean. There are 3 main interpretive frameworks, each with substantial scholarly support, each accounting for some of the evidence. Interpretation 1. Pure mythology. The most common academic reading treats everything we've examined as mythological in the literary sense: symbolic narratives created to explain origins, establish social hierarchies, encode religious truths, and provide psychological comfort in a chaotic world. In this view, the Apkallu aren't memories of actual fishmen, but personifications of the civilizing process. The animal forms represent natural forces: water, earth, sky. The wisdom transmission stories encode the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural society, from oral culture to literate civilization. The strength of this interpretation is its parsimony. It doesn't require believing in impossible beings or lost civilizations. It treats the Sumerians as sophisticated symbol makers who used vivid imagery to communicate abstract truths. Fishmen teach civilization because civilization depends on water management, irrigation, canal systems, river trade. Serpents represent wisdom because snakes live underground, close to the earth's hidden moisture, and shed their skin in what looks like rebirth. Birds carry knowledge between heaven and earth because birds fly, bridging the visible and invisible realms. This reading respects the intelligence of the ancient scribes. They weren't primitive people confusing myth with history. They were creating a coherent cosmology using the materials available to them: animal imagery, divine hierarchies, flood traditions borrowed from genuine geological disasters. The texts aren't testimony, they're theology. But this interpretation has limits. It doesn't fully explain the specificity of the details. Why 7 Apkallu paired with 7 antediluvian kings? Why the emphasis on pre-flood knowledge needing preservation? Why do the instructions of Shurupak explicitly frame themselves as antediluvian wisdom transmitted through memory? If it's all symbolic, the symbols are peculiarly detailed, peculiarly consistent, peculiarly resistant to variation, and it leaves unexplained why the Sumerians would choose this particular symbolic system. If they wanted to celebrate human achievement, why not depict humans as the inventors? Why insert these intermediate figures, beings who aren't gods, aren't human, but possess knowledge both need? The structure of the myths seems designed to emphasize human dependency, human lateness, human ignorance. That's a strange choice if the goal is cultural propaganda. Interpretation 2. Encoded philosophical wisdom. A second approach treats the texts as deliberately encoded teachings, esoteric knowledge hidden in narrative form, accessible only to initiates who understand the symbolic language. In this view, the Apkallu represents states of consciousness, stages of spiritual development, or psycho-spiritual principles. The flood is ego death, the dissolution of ordinary awareness, after which consciousness is reconstituted at a higher level. Animals represent aspects of the self, the serpent as kundalini energy, the bird as ascending spirit, the fish as the unconscious mind. This interpretation has roots in Jungian psychology and Western esoteric traditions. It treats mythology as a universal symbolic language, and Mesopotamian texts as one dialect of that language. The fishmen aren't historical or literal. They're archetypal images representing the integration of unconscious wisdom into conscious awareness. Learning from animals means learning from instinct, from embodied knowledge that precedes and grounds rational thought. The strength of this reading is that it takes the text seriously as wisdom literature without requiring belief in their literal content. It acknowledges that the myths contain profound insights about human nature, consciousness, and the structure of psyche. The emphasis on humans receiving rather than inventing knowledge mirrors the psychological truth that much of what we know isn't consciously created. It emerges from unconscious processes, dream work, intuition, body wisdom. The animal imagery, in this view, encodes the idea that rationality rests on a foundation of non-rational knowing. The fishmen are the unconscious, offering gifts the conscious mind doesn't yet understand. The serpent is transformation, shedding old forms to allow new growth. The bird is transcendence, the capacity to rise above immediate circumstances and perceive pattern. But this interpretation, like the first, struggles with the specificity. Jungian archetypes are supposed to be universal, appearing in similar forms across cultures, but the Apkallu are specifically Mesopotamian, tied to particular cities, particular kings, particular historical contexts. The cuneiform texts cite excavations, dynasties, temple constructions. They're embedded in a historical matrix that resists easy abstraction into universal psychology. And if the goal was spiritual teaching, why frame it as history? Why the king lists, the chronologies, the genealogies? Esoteric traditions usually mark themselves as esoteric. They use initiation rituals, secret languages, explicit warnings that the text contains hidden meanings. The Sumerian tablets don't do this. They present themselves as records, as remembered tradition, as information worth preserving, because it's true in a straightforward sense. Interpretation 3. Historical documentation of preserved memory. The third framework is more speculative, but also more literal. It suggests the texts preserve fragmentary memory of actual historical processes, however distorted by millennia of oral transmission and mythological accretion. In this reading, the Apkallu represent real knowledge bearers, not fishmen literally, but people who arrived by sea, who brought advanced skills, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, and whose arrival was remembered as the origin of civilization. The animal imagery would encode their foreignness, their otherness, the fact that they came from beyond the known world. fish form because they came from water, by boat, from coastal cultures or maritime trade networks. Their teachings weren't supernatural, they were technological and organisational. Writing is a technology, mathematics is a technology, urban planning is a technology. If these arrived in Mesopotamia from elsewhere, from a civilization that had developed them earlier, then the locals receiving this knowledge would naturally frame it as divine, as beyond human capacity, as taught by beings from another realm. The antediluvian chronology would preserve memory of a very long pre-literate period, compressed and distorted by oral tradition into impossibly long reign lengths. The flood would be a real catastrophe, rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age, or a major river flooding or a tsunami that destroyed earlier settlements and forced survivors to rebuild. The continuity of knowledge across the flood, preserved through Ziusudra's memory, would reflect the reality that some information survived through oral tradition, carried by refugees who escaped the disaster. This interpretation has support from archaeology. There is evidence of major flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BC. There are signs of cultural discontinuity followed by rapid development. The sudden appearance of writing around 3200 BC at Uruk is hard to explain through gradual evolution. It looks more like a technology that arrived or was imported or was developed by specialists whose skills had been accumulating for generations. And there's the persistent global pattern of flood myths, often connected to claims about pre-flood knowledge, not just in Mesopotamia, but across dozens of cultures on multiple continents. If these myths preserve memory of actual sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, then they're not independent inventions, they're cultural memory of a shared catastrophe preserved and transmitted across 12,000 years. The animal symbolism would reflect pre-literate methods of knowledge transmission. Before writing, information was encoded in images, gestures, rituals, performances. Animals were used as mnemonic devices, each species representing a category of knowledge, each behaviour demonstrating a principle. The fishmen wouldn't be literal hybrids, but ritual performers, shamanic figures, or simply foreigners whose cultural markers, body paint, tattooing, ceremonial masks made them appear animal-like to observers who didn't share their context. Over centuries, these memories would mythologize. The teachers would become divine. Their skills would seem magical. Their arrival would be dated to the beginning of time. But underneath the mythology, a historical process, knowledge arrived, was transmitted, was preserved, and the people who received it remembered that it came from outside, from beings who seemed different, whose forms were encoded in the imagery available to oral tradition. This reading takes the texts seriously as historical documents, but it doesn't require belief in the supernatural. It requires believing that oral tradition can preserve structural information across very long timescales, even if specific details become distorted. And there's evidence for this. Aboriginal Australian traditions preserve knowledge of coastlines that was submerged 10,000 years ago. Biblical genealogies preserve real historical figures mixed with legendary ancestors. The basic claim isn't implausible that myths contain historical memory, however transformed by retelling. But the skeptical response is legitimate. This could all be retrospective interpretation, reading history into texts that were never meant as history. Just because a myth mentions a flood doesn't mean the flood happened. Just because the Sumerians describe fishmen doesn't mean fishmen existed, or that someone came by sea. It might all be narrative invention, stories told to explain how things began, with no underlying historical referent. Each interpretation has merit. Each accounts for part of the evidence. The purely mythological reading explains the symbolic consistency, the theological function, the use of animal imagery as a literary device. The philosophical reading explains the depth of insight, the psychological truth, the sense that these texts contain wisdom about consciousness and human nature. The historical reading explains the specificity, the chronological framing, the emphasis on transmission and preservation. The question isn't which interpretation is correct. The question is which best serves our investigation into what the texts reveal about animal intelligence in ancient Mesopotamian thought. And the answer is all three together. The texts are mythological, they use symbols, metaphors, divine agents to communicate truths that transcend literal narrative. They're philosophical, they encode insights about knowledge, consciousness, the structure of learning, and they're historical. They preserve memory of cultural processes, technological transmission, the transition from one form of society to another. What all three readings share is the pattern we've been tracing. Intelligence in Mesopotamian thought originates outside humanity. Whether that origin is symbolic, the Abzu as metaphor for unconscious, psychological, the animal self as foundation for rational mind, or historical knowledge arriving from other cultures or older traditions, the structure remains the same. Humans don't invent, humans receive. And what we receive arrives in forms that aren't human. Animals, animal form beings, hybrid creatures, teachers who embody knowledge before they speak it. The Sumerians believed this, or at minimum, they preserved it in their most sacred texts, their educational literature, their ritual practices. For 3,000 years, they copied these stories, carved these images, invoked these figures, and taught their children to honour beings whose intelligence preceded humanity's. Whether the Apkallu were real or metaphorical doesn't change the worldview they represent. A worldview where human consciousness is derivative, where wisdom requires humility, where learning means paying attention to forms of intelligence that don't mirror our own. That worldview is what the tablets preserve, and it's what we've lost, what the tablets still hold. It's late now, you're still listening. The darkness has thickened, or the light has returned, depending on where you are, what time it is in your part of the world. And we're back where we started, in the basement vault beneath Philadelphia, standing in front of CBS 1673, the Eridu Genesis tablet, the fragment of baked clay that suggested animals were once smarter than humans. We've travelled far from that opening question, through king lists and flood narratives, through myths of fishmen and serpent gods, through the Abzu where knowledge waits, and the me that structure existence. We've examined how the Sumerians described intelligence, not as uniquely human, not as invented by us, but as distributed across forms, embodied in creatures, transmitted from older sources. And now we have to ask, what does it mean? Not what it meant to the Sumerians, we've explored their worldview in detail, but what it means to us, now 4,000 years later, reading these texts through the lens of modern consciousness, aware of evolutionary biology and neuroscience and cognitive ethology. The scientific consensus is clear. Animals possess intelligence, different forms than ours, operating through different neural architectures, producing different outputs, but intelligence nonetheless. Ravens solve multi-step problems. Octopi demonstrate tool use. Elephants mourn their dead. Whales have cultural traditions transmitted across generations. Ants build megastructures through emergent collective behaviour. Slime moulds navigate mazes. Intelligence is everywhere, pervasive, distributed across the tree of life in forms we're only beginning to understand. The Sumerians didn't have evolutionary theory. They didn't know about neurons or genes or information processing, but they observed the world, and they concluded animals know things, not symbolically, actually. Animals possess knowledge that humans need and don't inherently have. And in the deep past, before humans developed civilization, that animal knowledge was primary. It came first. Humans learned from it. Modern science supports a version of this claim. Before language, before abstract reasoning, before symbolic thought, hominins learned by observation. We watched predators and learned hunting strategies. We watched birds and learned migration routes. We watched tool using primates and refined our own tool use. Cultural transmission began with imitation, and much of what was imitated was animal behaviour, adapted and abstracted for human purposes. The Sumerian tablets preserve this in mythological form. The Apkallu, rising from the sea to teach civilization, are encoded memory of learning from outside, of knowledge arriving rather than being invented. The emphasis on animals surviving the flood preserves the recognition that human civilization depends on the entire ecology. Remove the animals and the humans can't function. The me embodied in animal behaviour reflect the reality that complex behaviours have structure, that patterns exist in nature before humans abstract them into cultural principles. So in a sense, the tablets are right. Animals were smarter first. Not smarter than humans, that's a category error, comparing different kinds of intelligence, but temporally prior. The intelligence that builds nests and coordinates hunts and navigates by stars existed long before the intelligence that writes cuneiform and constructs ziggurats. Billions of years of evolution produced sophisticated cognitive systems long before hominins walked upright. Humans didn't invent intelligence. We inherited it, refined it, redirected it toward new purposes, but the foundation, perception, memory, learning, problem solving, communication was there in our ancestors, who were animals, who learned from other animals, who survived by being integrated into an ecosystem where intelligence took countless forms. The Sumerian tablets, in their mythological language, preserve awareness of this. They don't present humans as superior, chosen, uniquely rational. They present us as latecomers, learners, recipients of knowledge from sources we didn't control. The fishmen, the serpent gods, the great birds, these are ways of honouring the intelligence that precedes us, that exists outside us, that we depend on even as we transform it. This is the gift the tablets offer, a reminder that intelligence is older than humanity, broader than human consciousness, embodied in forms we share the world with, a reminder that learning requires humility, that wisdom means paying attention, that the creatures around us carry knowledge we haven't fully accessed. Modern culture has largely forgotten this. We've built a civilization that treats human intelligence as the only intelligence that matters, that reduces animals to resources or obstacles, that assumes nature is inert material waiting to be shaped by human will. The Sumerian worldview challenges this. It says, no, the world is full of minds, not like yours, but real, ancient, worthy of respect. And it says, your civilization wasn't inevitable. It was transmitted. You learned it. You received it. From gods, from sages, from beings who appeared in forms you didn't understand. You didn't pull it out of your own minds. It came from outside, from the Abzu, from the depths, from the primordial source where all knowledge waits. Whether this is literally true, whether fishmen existed, whether knowledge resides in an underground ocean, is less important than what the structure of the belief reveals. The Sumerians saw themselves as part of a larger system. They believed intelligence was distributed. They honoured the beings who carried it, even when those beings looked nothing like them. We could learn from this, not by believing in Apkallu, but by taking seriously the idea that human intelligence isn't the centre of intelligence, that other forms exist, that we might still have things to learn from creatures whose minds operate according to principles we don't fully understand. The tablets are fragments. 2/3 of CBS 1673 is lost. The Apkallu tradition survives only in scattered references, reconstructed from ritual texts and later summaries. The Sumerian king list preserves names we can't verify, chronologies we can't accept, events we can't confirm. We're reading through layers of time, translation, interpretation, transformation. But the pattern persists. Across all the fragments, the pattern holds. Intelligence came from outside. It was carried by forms that weren't human. Humans received, learned, inherited. Civilization is transmission, not invention. And animals, in the beginning, were the carriers. Not metaphorically, actually. Whatever intelligence humans now possess, its roots go deeper than our species, deeper than our genus, deeper than our family. Back through millions of years of evolution, through ancestors who were increasingly animal-like, increasingly embedded in ecologies where survival meant learning from thousands of other species, each demonstrating principles of navigation, cooperation, predation, communication, memory. The Sumerians encoded this as myth. We decode it as evolutionary history. Both are saying the same thing: you weren't first. You learned from beings who came before. And those beings, in the deep past, looked nothing like you. That's what the tablets reveal. Not proof of ancient aliens or lost civilizations, but preserved awareness that intelligence is ancient, distributed, embodied in countless forms. That human consciousness is one expression among many. That wisdom requires honouring the minds we share the world with, even when those minds think in ways we can't fully translate. The clay is cool under museum lights. The cuneiform is crisp, each wedge pressed with intention 4,000 years ago. And if you read it carefully, if you let the pattern emerge across all the sources, the tablets say, before you built cities, something else already knew. Before you wrote language, something else already communicated. Before you thought in symbols, something else already solved problems. You are not the beginning of intelligence. You are the inheritors of it. And the inheritance is older, stranger, more distributed than you imagined. The animals knew first. The fishmen carried it to the surface. The gods guarded it in the Abzu. And you received it, shaped it, built from it, forgetting where it came from. But the tablets remember. That's what they hold. That's what they've always held. And maybe 4,000 years after they were written, in your own time, in your own place, wherever you're listening from, maybe it's time to remember too. Not to believe in fishmen or serpent gods, but to recognise that intelligence is older than us, that wisdom exists in forms we didn't create, that the world we inhabit is full of minds we barely understand. The Sumerians knew this. They wrote it down. They preserved it. And now, if we're willing to read carefully, willing to see the pattern, willing to ask what these texts might actually be saying beneath their mythological surface, we can know it too. Not as myth, as reality. The animals were smarter first, not because they were superior, but because they were first. And we learned from them. Everything we call civilization traces back eventually to watching creatures who already lived the principles we later named. That's the truth the tablets hold. And holding it, reading it, understanding it, letting it change how we see the world, might be the most important thing we can do with ancient wisdom. Not to worship the past, but to recognise what it preserved. Awareness that we're part of something larger, older, stranger than human history. That intelligence surrounds us in forms that don't speak our languages but carry knowledge nonetheless. The clay endures, the wedges remain, and the message pressed into earth 4,000 years ago waits for anyone willing to read it. You've heard it now. The pattern is clear. The question is what you'll do with it. Sleep well. Dream of fish and serpents and birds. Let your mind wander through the Abzu, where knowledge waits, timeless, distributed across forms, older than cities, older than language, older than the boundaries we use to separate ourselves from the rest of the living world. The tablets have spoken, the animals remember, and somewhere in the intersection of ancient myth and modern recognition, there's a wisdom we desperately need. We are not alone in thinking. We never were. And the sooner we remember this, the sooner we might learn to live as what we actually are. One form of intelligence among many, sharing a world with minds we've barely begun to understand. Rest now. The investigation is complete. The evidence is presented. The question remains open, as it should, as it always has. Were the animals smarter, or were they simply first? And does it matter which, as long as we remember to learn from them? Good night.